true history of human brutality is seldom found in the savage flare-ups documented in hastily scribbled chronicles. It resides instead in the quiet, meticulously organized spaces, the workshops and subterranean chambers, where suffering was not simply enacted, but systematized. To understand pain in the medieval context, we must discard the romantic notion of the barbaric rite. Instead, imagine a bureaucratic infrastructure, a sophisticated system for extracting certainty from absolute chaos. We are entering an intellectualized realm, one that sought to transform agony into admissible evidence. The act of torture, viewed through the eyes of the Inquisition and state courts, was rarely perceived as mere revenge or uncontrolled rage. It possessed, chillingly, a procedural integrity. Pain became a form of technological consulting, a means by which divine justice, when questioned, could be applied with meticulous, if horrifying, standardization. Consider this shift in perspective, from spontaneous violence to institutional necessity. The authorities were not merely brutal, they were professional. They developed protocols. They required manuals. This was an age that wrestled deeply with the nature of truth itself, a truth perceived as a divine commodity, and thus something tangible, if agonizingly difficult, to retrieve. In these early workshops, often housed deep beneath stone structures, the tools themselves were subject to craftsmanship. The interrogators needed not just malice, but an understanding of physics, anatomy, and jurisprudence. They required devices that could reliably scale suffering, allowing a precise gradient of agony from minor discomfort designed merely to break resolve to catastrophic trauma intended for full confession. The early methodologies demonstrate a startling commitment to efficiency. The examination of the subject was not a brawl. It was an assessment. One needed to understand where maximum psychological stress could be applied with minimum physical expenditure, maximizing the probability of compliance. This suggests that suffering itself was viewed as a resource, a highly pressurized yield required by the demands of maintaining order and reinforcing ideological belief. The very architecture of these interrogation centers reflected this industrial approach to torment. They were engineered spaces designed for control. Damp stone walls meant to absorb sound, thick doors to ensure absolute privacy, and utilitarian furniture around which specialized tools were arrayed like surgical implements. The scent of stale incense mixed with the metallic tang of fear and blood, a grim perfume that spoke of ritualized violation. Initially, however, torture was deeply entangled in theological mandates. Before it was a state procedure, it was often framed as divine judgment. If God had revealed sin through spiritual suffering, then earthly justice, when failing to pierce the veil of deceit, must employ a similar methodology. The suspect was not merely accused, They were suspected of undermining the cosmic order, of harboring heresies that challenged the foundational structure of heaven and earth. This blending of spiritual crisis and judicial procedure gave torture an almost sacred justification in the eyes of its practitioners. To apply pain was to participate in a divinely sanctioned act of purification. It was believed, tragically, that the body would betray the soul, that the localized physical distress would necessarily translate into the liberation of guarded truth. The documentation accompanying these methods is perhaps the most chilling aspect. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were codified procedures, written down in thick, leather-bound registers and illuminated legal diagrams. They provided checklists. First, the recitation of accusations. Second, the determination of culpability and resistance. Third, the selection of the appropriate mechanism, judged by the severity of the perceived transgression. The emergence of these protocols signifies a monumental intellectual shift. Suffering had moved from the realm of uncontrolled passion into the rigorous sphere of legal theory. It was no longer simply brutal. It was academically justifiable. The state did not merely want truth. It needed proof that its elaborate, complex system of moral and physical control was functioning perfectly. The preliminary stages often involved psychological duress before any mechanical trauma was inflicted. Deprivation of sleep, controlled diets, forced viewing of accusations. These were the initial compliance measures. They chipped away at self-preservation, establishing an immediate, unequal power dynamic where resistance became synonymous with agonizing fatigue. Only once the mental reserves were visibly depleted did the authorities escalate to devices designed for physical leverage. The Inquisition's workshop, therefore, was not just a site of pain. It was a crucible of emergent legal technology. It demonstrated how sophisticated bureaucratic systems can adopt and refine methods traditionally seen as mindless savagery, transforming them into manageable, repeatable processes. This transformation allowed the state to monetize fear, making institutional cruelty predictable, scalable, and most disturbingly, defensible in the name of justice. In the preceding chapter, we began to dismantle the romantic notion of torture as merely spontaneous brutality. We established that pain in this era was not a random outburst of violence. It was an early form of technology, an intellectualized process that required documentation and protocol. The very act of inflicting suffering had been absorbed into the machinery of state governance. But merely acknowledging its systematization is only half the battle. To truly understand its power, we must examine how it was legalized, how the raw infliction of agony transitioned from a localized measure of wrath into an established pillar of civil law. This shift represents perhaps the most insidious aspect of institutional brutality. The moment suffering becomes not just permissible, but procedurally necessary. The medieval legal apparatus required order above all else, and in the absence of modern forensic science, in an age where suspicion, accusation, and rumor held more weight than verifiable fact, the mechanism for achieving truth had to be rigorous, predictable, and most damningly, highly authorized. The law did not simply permit pain, it codified its deployment. It determined who possessed the authority to wield a rack or select a brand, defining them by rank, mandate, and signed decree. The transformation was profound. Torture ceased being an emergency measure reserved for times of catastrophic unrest and became a defined procedural step in the judicial life cycle. The legal documents themselves become primary sources here, acting less like records of trials and more like technical manuals on human vulnerability. We are presented with flowcharts, jurisdictional boundaries, and meticulous lists detailing the appropriate application of pain based on the perceived severity of the crime or the station of the accused. Consider the bureaucratic weight applied to suffering. Investigators were no longer merely zealous interrogators. They became trained specialists in coercion. They had to justify their methods not just through appeals to divine justice, but through adherence to increasingly complex procedural rules. These regulations dictated everything from the physical preparation of the suspect, the removal of clothes, the isolation, the documented cataloging of wounds, to the precise degree and duration of discomfort applied. This standardization served multiple critical functions for the ruling powers. First, it provided a shield against charges of arbitrary violence. If the official protocol stipulated that questioning must proceed through 3 stages, each escalating in severity, then failure to follow those specific steps made the torturer guilty of malpractice, rather than simply brutal law enforcement. Second, and perhaps more chillingly, it allowed for the commercialization of suffering. The knowledge, the tools, and the personnel required to operate this system created a niche, highly valuable expertise. In major urban centers and powerful courts, specialized individuals, the pain masters, or legal interrogators emerged. They were highly paid functionaries whose mastery lay in understanding both the psychology of the terrified suspect and the precise legal tolerances of their superiors. The law demanded proof, and when empirical evidence failed, it defaulted to institutionalized pain as a proxy for certainty. The state was essentially funding a systematic psychological breakdown requiring complex record-keeping that detailed not just what happened, but why it was deemed necessary for stability. These records paint a picture of an administrative system grappling with an unquantifiable variable, the human mind under extreme duress. The process thus became one of iterative refinement. The judicial systems were inherently suspicious of their own efficiency. Why is the confession of 10 men preferred to the silence of one, if that silence threatens the entire social order? By institutionalizing pain, the state was able to treat truth extraction not as a matter of discovery, but as a quantifiable transaction, a service purchased by the maintenance of civil peace. These early forms of legal torture were therefore profoundly intertwined with concepts of accountability and debt. The accused was rarely seen simply as an individual person. They were often treated as a legal deficiency in the social body, a source of instability that needed to be corrected through suffering until compliance, the confession, was achieved. The rise of bureaucracy did not eliminate cruelty, it refined its mechanics. It gave it predictable boundaries and administrative elegance. Where earlier ages might have seen localized blood feuds spilling into sporadic acts of vengeance, the medieval period developed a sophisticated system that integrated brutality into the very ledger books of justice. The agony was cataloged, cross-referenced, and approved by committees. This is where we see the profound intellectual detachment of the era's power structures. They weren't just cruel, they were methodical. They understood that control over human pain was the ultimate tool of governance. It allowed them to manufacture consent, to create a narrative of order, using physical violation as its foundation. The law became not a framework for justice, but an elaborate set of instructions on how best to manage terror. By the end of this bureaucratic evolution, torture had attained a frightening level of legitimacy. It was embedded in the scholarly texts, cited by canon lawyers, and taught in specialized legal colleges. To challenge the process meant challenging the established order itself. The state did not need outright obedience. It only needed the belief that its system for managing fear was infallible, scientifically validated by law, and divinely sanctioned by necessity. This standardization of agony sets the stage for everything that follows, for the mechanical marvels, the public displays, and the chemically enhanced ordeals. The bureaucratic structure provides the enduring scaffolding upon which medieval brutality could be erected, ensuring that suffering was never again merely a crime of passion, but a calculated act of state policy. To understand the machinery of medieval pain, we must first understand its engineering. The early concepts of judicial suffering were crude, almost primal straps, ropes, blunt force trauma applied by hand and whim. But as justice became systematized, pain itself had to be quantified, measured, and predictable. It needed specifications, materials, and mathematical logic. And nowhere is this cold, mechanical precision more vividly displayed than in the device we call the rack. To look at the rack is not merely to witness historical brutality. It is to examine an early, terrifying convergence of physics and state power. It represents the idealization of suffering, a method designed to maximize output while minimizing visible effort on the part of the executioner. The academic gaze upon this device reveals less about the cruelty of its operators than it does about the nascent bureaucracy that required such complex systems. Imagine a contraption of sturdy, dark wood and meticulously prepared leather, built not for random violence, but for controlled deconstruction. Its operation speaks to a deeply ingrained Enlightenment-like belief in mechanical efficiency. Even when applied to human flesh, the rack itself is deceptively simple, which makes its terrifying potential all the more unsettling. At its core, it harnesses one of humanity's oldest fears, the inability to resist external force. It operates purely on leverage. The victim is secured to the frame, usually by the wrists and ankles, the points where human bone structure provides maximum resistance to pulling apart. As the sophisticated mechanism, often powered by winches or multiple men working in concert, exerts tension upon these anchor points, the biological structure of the body resists at all costs. This resistance, however fierce, is merely a measurable variable in the equation of interrogation. The mechanics are brutal in their poetic efficiency. The initial strain is agonizing enough, stretching sinews and ligaments beyond their natural limit. But as the tension increases, systematically and incrementally, the suffering transitions from taut, sharp pain into a deep, grinding systemic dislocation. Bones begin to protest under stresses they were never designed to bear. Joints pop with audible, dreadful pops of separation. Tendons scream in molecular distress. This process is not sudden obliteration through brute force, but a slow, agonizing stretch, a forced biological overextension that strips the subject down to their most fundamental state of material vulnerability. It was leverage applied to flesh, proving that sometimes the greatest horror can be achieved with minimal raw power, provided one has sufficient mechanical ingenuity. The historical record suggests an almost clinical application of this device. Torturers were not depicted as rabid zealots, rather, they seem to have been technicians following a highly specified protocol. They needed to achieve a particular degree of compliance, a state where the subject's physical pain was so intense that it eclipsed their fear of death, forcing their mind into a desperate negotiation with the authorities. The goal wasn't just injury for its own sake. It was the forced surrender of self-control in exchange for the cessation of agony. And in that moment of absolute systemic collapse, when the body screams betrayal and resistance is mathematically impossible, the authorities believed they had acquired truth. The rack's function, therefore, transcended simple torture. It became a diagnostic tool, an institutional arbiter of reality. By systematically breaking down the physical boundaries of the accused, the state sought to break down the walls of their constructed narrative. The pain acted as a solvent on the will, dissolving layers of deceit until only the core confession remained, the required output for maintaining the sacred illusion of justice. It was the ultimate commodification of bodily integrity. The body became an object upon which legal and theological hypotheses were tested until they yielded a marketable piece of information. This systemic approach elevated pain from spontaneous outburst to scheduled, budgeted procedure. It forces us to confront a disquieting truth that, at its most bureaucratic, suffering becomes intellectualized. The rack was not simply inflicting damage. It was demonstrating the state's absolute mastery over biological physics. It presented an inescapable conclusion. If your body, the most sacred and private vessel of selfhood, could be so effortlessly dismantled by man-made machinery, then your very account of events could also be disassembled and rebuilt according to the requirements of law. This intellectualization is perhaps its darkest legacy. The horror was not merely in the snapping joints. It resided in the chilling realization that the state had developed a reliable, almost predictable method for making defiance mathematically impossible. Having established how the state first engineered pain as a tool for truth extraction, we must now turn our gaze away from the interrogation chamber and toward the public square. The purpose of suffering did not end when the accused was found guilty. In fact, the state required a visible conclusion, a final, definitive statement broadcast to the collective citizenry. Here, torture transitioned from an investigative procedure into a highly formalized punitive display. The body as a commodity. The pain once used solely for extracting confession now became the raw material for social and economic management. Consider the brutal efficacy of branding. It was perhaps one of history's most potent and least efficient tools of state control. Yet its ubiquity attests to its cultural power. To burn skin with hot iron was not merely an act of vengeance. It was a legal, visible transaction. The searing heat did more than just injure the flesh. It inscribed debt, crime, or diminished status permanently onto the epidermis. When the brands were placed, be they letters denoting theft, specific symbols indicating heresy, or marks signifying indentured servitude, they transformed human bodies into walking ledgers of transgression. They were a tangible representation of social capital lost, bought back through agony. The act of branding itself was an industrialized ritual. It required specialized artisans, precise measurements, and public execution grounds designed for spectacle. The mark had to be legible, not just physically permanent, but symbolically clear. These marks served several functions simultaneously. They acted as a deterrent to the observing populace, reinforcing the absolute power of law. They delineated social boundaries by making visible who belonged inside the police and who was rendered permanently outside it. And they provided a mechanism for debt repayment that transcended mere currency. A person branded with a mark of outstanding civic obligation was literally marked as compromised until the symbolic debt, the physical suffering itself, was paid off through time or further servitude. This system built upon the logic established in earlier chapters. If one could standardize pain to extract a confession, they could equally standardize lasting injury to enforce social obedience. The body ceased being viewed primarily as an autonomous self, owned by its occupant, and became instead merely transferable property, a piece of flesh available for state utilization. If you cheated on your taxes, or evaded military conscription, or simply defied the local magistrate's whim, the punishment did not end with imprisonment. It was etched onto your very skin. But the commodification of suffering extended far beyond mere punitive marks. It touched upon the fundamental legal concept of ownership. When a person was adjudged an outcast, perhaps due to bankruptcy, radical ideology, or even familial disgrace, their body could be devalued and repurposed. This is where we move from simple punishment into true commodity exchange. Certain labor gangs, marginalized groups, or individuals who had failed economically were literally branded for sale or assigned to specific tasks until they worked themselves back into a state of recognized personhood. The skin itself became an asset that diminished in value the longer it remained on a non-productive body. The public display accompanying these punitive measures was crucial. It provided the necessary dramatic climax to the bureaucratic process. A mere fine levied privately carried negligible weight. But when the judgment, the branding, and the resulting maiming were performed in the town square, watched by hundreds of onlookers, the message was amplified across every social stratum, from the highest-ranking nobility, who attended out of morbid curiosity, to the lowest classes, who witnessed it as a predictable cycle of life and death. The spectacle turned justice into entertainment. The pain was choreographed for maximum viewing effect. Consider the logistics, ensuring the perfect blend of terror, ritual precision, and public documentation. The records of these incidents, the detailed measurements of the brand, the testimony describing the victim's agony, became themselves historical documents, validating not just the crime, but the entire edifice of institutional power that necessitated such violence in the first place. The body, therefore, was not merely subjected to pain. It was methodically disassembled and reassembled by the state according to its perceived utility. The scars were maps of social debt. The brand marks told a story understood only by the ruling class. This person crossed a line that costs permanence, dignity, and physical integrity. These methods proved incredibly effective because they operated on multiple levels simultaneously. They were punitive, economic, psychological, and theatrical. They didn't just punish a crime, they fundamentally redefined what it meant to be a recognized member of society. It is a chilling meditation on the relationship between law and flesh. How quickly does the belief in immutable legal order permit man to treat the most fundamental aspect of humanity, its own skin, its own integrity, as nothing more than easily transferable property. These brutal practices force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that for centuries, civilization's commitment to order was frequently subsidized by the visible management and monetization of suffering. The pain endured in public, etched forever on the body, served as a foundational pillar for the social contracts that followed it. It is a profound reminder that the history of law, at its darkest heart, is often nothing more than a deeply sophisticated business model based entirely upon fear. In the chapters preceding this one, we moved from the visible machinery of pain to its legal framework. We saw how suffering was codified, systematized, and made predictable a transaction required by the maintenance of state authority. But even with the rise of the rack and the iron branding tool, there remained an entire dimension of judicial power that operated outside the workshop's strict protocols. The ordeal trials were unique because they claimed to bypass human fallibility entirely. They did not ask judges or torturers for their opinion. Instead, they outsourced divine judgment itself. In essence, justice was treated less as a matter of evidence and more as a question of chemistry, theology, and extreme physical endurance. This era of judicial procedure represents an intriguing anthropological study. When man lacked the perceived certainty of objective law, he turned to the seemingly absolute will of a higher power. The core principle was simple but profoundly terrifying. By surviving a prescribed test, one proved innocence. By failing it, by being consumed or crippled, one confessed guilt. The state did not merely administer justice in these cases, it managed risk itself. It was performing a massive, public ritualized assessment of truth, using painful physical experiments as its diagnostic tool. The accusation would determine the specific chemistry involved: hot iron for metal disputes, boiling pitch for charges against divine order, or perhaps even water involving sacred objects. The stakes were absolute. These were not questions that allowed for nuanced legal interpretation. They demanded binary results: innocent by heavenly grace, or guilty under inescapable spiritual damnation. The court acted as the architect of suffering, meticulously crafting a scenario where survival was proof of righteousness. We are watching a spectacular confluence of law, faith, and chemistry. Consider the ordeal by hot iron. When an accuser claimed theft, say, involving contested metal goods, the court did not call witnesses or demand written testimony. Instead, they ordered that the disputed items be heated to a point of intense, glowing agony, and then tested on the accused skin. The underlying assumption was that only the divinely pure would emerge unscathed from this trial by fire. The process transformed physical pain into verifiable spiritual data. It was a primitive, yet highly structured form of risk assessment, suggesting that in the absence of empirical evidence, visible trauma could serve as an acceptable substitute for truth. The law became deeply intertwined with metallurgy and the esoteric properties of heat. And then there was boiling pitch. This method speaks to the state's paranoia concerning not just crime, but corruption of the soul itself. Pitch, a viscous, suffocating substance derived from natural resins, carried layers of symbolic weight. It represented things trapped, slow-moving, and deeply toxic. To be immersed in boiling pitch was a form of ultimate judicial obliteration. It suggested that certain forms of transgression were so profound, so inherently contaminating, that they required the most chemically extreme means of detection. The legal administration of these ordeals is what fascinates us from an academic perspective. These trials were not simply random acts of brutality. They followed meticulously documented protocols regarding preparation, application temperature, and examination afterwards. There was a formal right to appeal based on the outcome, establishing a pseudo-judicial integrity within profound horror. The state had invented a judicial chemistry set. What these ordeals reveal is the deep cultural comfort the medieval mind took in externalizing decision-making to non-human forces, be they heavenly fire, boiling pitch, or the unyielding weight of mechanical leverage. When human intelligence struggled to reconcile complex social discord with clear legal answers, it would default to a supernatural certainty that could be physically manifested and measured. This was justice by proxy. The court did not determine guilt. The elements were supposed to do it for them. The law allowed man to outsource his cognitive difficulty to elemental force. It transformed inherent cultural anxiety into an actionable physical protocol. We are witnessing a legal system that monetizes faith itself, a horrific economy where the certainty of damnation and the promise of heavenly grace were traded against flesh and bone. These procedures establish a critical historical precedent that institutional violence, even when theoretically justified by divine law, follows predictable protocols. The methodology matters as much as the outcome. Before we move on to methods designed for prolonged psychological breakdown, we must recognize this foundation laid by Ordeal, that in medieval society, pain was not merely punishment. It was an experimental variable used to test the very structure of reality itself. We have traveled through the magnificent, terrifying architecture of pain. From the leveraged agony of iron machinery to the commodification of flesh in the public square, we have seen how suffering was not simply experienced, but catalogued, calculated, and contained by the law. If previous chapters examined the tools, the rack, the brand, the standardized protocol, this chapter delves into the volatile chemistry of terror itself, the deliberate, sustained infliction of discomfort using substances designed to resist the body's natural defenses. This is an examination not just of pain, but of duration, of how prolonged dread and agonizing limitation could become a powerful tactical advantage in a judicial setting. The methods discussed here, the scalding pitch, the boiling oils, the noxious liquids, represent a terrifying fusion of chemical knowledge and institutional cruelty. These were not merely acts of spontaneous brutality. They were highly controlled procedures requiring specialized materials, containment vessels, and crucially, personnel trained to monitor the precise rate of suffering. To understand their application is to grasp how far legal bureaucracy would extend itself if its ultimate goal was not justice, but absolute, irrefutable compliance. Pitch, specifically, served as a master class in protracted discomfort. It possesses a unique viscoelastic quality. When liquid, it flows with a deceptive smoothness. When cooling, it hardens into an unyielding, restrictive shell. Its application demonstrated the ability of the state to manipulate physical boundaries using chemistry. The process was necessarily slow, designed not for immediate breakage, but for gradual, corrosive despair. It coated wounds and restricted movement in ways that defied mere superficial pain. The suffering derived from a creeping sense of entrapment, as if the very molecules of the accuser's tormentor were meant to seep into their pores. Similarly chilling was the use of boiling oils and other hot agents. These substances offered a level of controlled destructive power previously unmatched in legal torture. They required considerable technical expertise, knowing the precise temperature at which the tissue would suffer maximum damage without immediately causing death, which might prematurely ending the profitable interrogation session. The objective here was to create a steady state of agony, intense enough to force a confession, but not so extreme as to render the subject unconscious or dead, thus preventing any further useful interrogation. The genius, if one can use such a clinical term for such depravity, lay in its subtlety. Unlike the sheer catastrophic shock delivered by the rack's sudden tension, these methods permitted a form of sustained, manageable torment. The agony was prolonged and systemic. It attacked skin, muscle, nerves, and most profoundly, the psychological will. What we are witnessing across this history of pain is not merely the casual application of violence. It is the industrialization of terror. Suffering becomes an input variable in a bureaucratic equation. The state views the human body, its tissues, its fluids, its very capacity to endure, as a resource to be mined. Pitch and oil, when administered correctly, were sophisticated extraction tools, enabling officials to treat the flesh not as a sacred vessel, but as pliable material subject to chemical stress testing. This required a complete restructuring of legal oversight. Who determines the exact concentration of the substance? What is the prescribed duration of exposure? Which legal authority grants permission for an escalation from a simple blow to a full immersion in boiling tar? The answer invariably traces back to court mandate and bureaucratic approval. Pain, by being chemically defined and timed, was made into a quantifiable commodity. It could be recorded on parchment, justifying its expenditure both physically and legally. The record itself became the ultimate sign of institutional power, the written proof that suffering had occurred, mandated by law, in service of perceived stability. Moreover, these methods expanded the nature of interrogation beyond merely physical resistance. When one is coated in a restrictive, caustic substance, the threat moves inward. One begins to fear not only the tormentor's next action, but the slow deterioration of their own existence. The prisoner loses control over their immediate environment. They are subject to the element, the chemist, and the judge all at once. This loss of agency was perhaps the most potent psychological weapon, turning life itself into a monitored failure. As we conclude this exploration of chemical agony, we must ask ourselves what these methods reveal about the nature of civilization attempting to define truth. When law loses its footing in pure evidence, when documents are burned and witnesses recant, the state resorts to pain science. It constructs an elaborate system where divine judgment gives way to forensic chemistry. The body becomes a laboratory under institutional observation, designed solely for the extraction of narratives that fit pre-existing power structures. These agonizing procedures allowed the authorities not just to find truth, but more critically, to manufacture it. They trained generations of legal operatives how to manage pain as a resource, transforming inherent human vulnerability into a predictable, actionable law. This history leaves us with an unsettling image that perhaps the greatest cruelty is not the act of physical torture itself, but the sophisticated, dispassionate paperwork required to justify its perfect execution. We have spent chapters examining the mechanics of suffering. We've looked at the rack, analyzing its leverage points. We studied branding irons, treating scars as quantifiable debts. And in our previous discussions, we dissected boiling pitch, recognizing it not merely as cruelty, but as a highly technical, regulated process managed by state-sanctioned specialists. What these devices, the mechanical, the chemical, the artisanal, had in common was their ultimate goal: the manufacture of narrative truth. The focus has always been on the asterisk application asterisk of pain. But history reveals that the true sophistication lay not in the iron or the oil, but in the bureaucratic management of the resulting confession itself. This chapter examines how institutional brutality transitioned from a physical act into a profoundly psychological process. The crafting of consensus through coercive narrative. The state did not necessarily require an actual truth. It required a useful truth. And nothing was more useful to maintaining the delicate, brittle equilibrium of medieval power than a confession that confirmed existing fears and cemented established power structures. Pain became less about revelation and more about performance. The accuser was no longer merely being interrogated for factual knowledge. They were being forced into a highly controlled dramatic role, a script written by their captors. The objective shifted from uncovering what happened to generating a narrative that explained why it must have happened, and why the state structure remained untouchable. This realization demands us to analyze the confession not as an endpoint of justice, but as its final, malleable product. Consider the inherent instability of the medieval world. Information was scarce, memory was fallible, and dissent could rapidly destabilize a local lord or entire regime. Therefore, the power vacuum had to be filled with something authoritative, something legally binding. And that something became the coerced narrative. The confessional booth itself becomes a piece of institutional architecture, physically defining the space where raw pain meets fabricated reality. It is here that the accused, broken both physically and psychologically by devices like the rack or the irons, was guided toward speaking. They were not simply recounting events. They were participating in a deep psychological performance. This process required a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, an early, dark form of behavioral modification. The system thrived on suggestion and implication. When physical torture had exhausted the body's resilience, when the flesh was screaming volumes that could not be deciphered, interrogators moved to the mind. They employed psychological pressure points, gaslighting the accused about their perceived allies or friends, presenting meticulously crafted pieces of evidence, forged documents, coerced testimony from others that made denial psychologically untenable. The torture apparatus became a set design for maximum narrative compliance. The physical trauma served as the necessary precursor to the mental breakdown, lowering resistance until the only path of least psychological resistance was utter surrender to the imposed storyline. The resulting confession, therefore, is not an objective historical record. It is a legally validated piece of high-stakes dramatic fiction. It is the perfect narrative, one that neatly closes all open questions, assigns blame according to known prejudices, and most importantly, justifies the existing moral and legal framework of the state that conducted the interrogation. By manufacturing this palatable consensus, the entire brutal endeavor could be rationalized back into the comfortable categories of justice and order. This was the zenith of bureaucratic control over human experience. They had perfected a mechanism where suffering provided not merely evidence, but meaning. The confession served as legal proof that divine justice had been achieved. It proved that the community's moral order, however cruel its methods, was fundamentally sound and necessary. This narrative manufactured truth through compliance. Any contradiction in testimony was deemed a lingering stain of malice or lingering delusion, easily dismissed by the court's internal logic. The state didn't need perfect truth. It needed sufficient truth to maintain power. They built machines for pain, not just to break bones, but to shatter subjectivity itself. And once the individual mind had been rendered utterly dependent on the captor's interpretation of reality, the narrative, the lie, was cemented into the unassailable reality of the legal record. And this is where we confront the ultimate chilling paradox. The very act intended to reveal profound personal truth ends up merely serving to confirm systemic power structures. Suffering becomes a service industry. Agony provides content for maintaining civic myths. It transforms profound human vulnerability, the desperate need to be understood, to be absolved, or simply to stop hurting, into the raw material of institutional profit. What does society say about its enemies when its highest legal function is not justice, but the production of perfect, compelling state-approved fiction? By understanding how the confession was engineered, we see that the greatest cruelty wasn't the physical device, but the realization that human consciousness itself could be processed, measured, and ultimately rendered into a consumable piece of bureaucratic documentation. It stands as a chilling testament to man's capacity to rationalize absolute brutality under the guise of intellectual rigor and divinely mandated order. We have traced the painful architecture of medieval justice, from mechanical leverage to controlled confession. We understood that pain was not simply an outburst of rage, but a process, a documented procedure governed by specific rules and specialized knowledge. Yet, understanding the mechanics of suffering is insufficient if we do not understand its justification. To wield terror with systemic efficacy, one must first build a theoretical foundation for it. This brings us to the highest level of cruelty, the intellectual scaffolding that made systematic torture not merely permissible, but morally requisite. The brutal efficiency of medieval pain was rarely left to chance. It did not exist in the chaos of spontaneous rage or battlefield vengeance. It required systems, protocols, and a vast administrative apparatus. By Chapter 9, we arrive at an unsettling precipice, standing not in the smoky dungeon of the past, but within the echoing archives where records of agony are stored. We must ask, what durable residue remains from these epochs of systematic suffering? Did the knowledge of how to inflict pain simply vanish with the Enlightenment's promise of reason and humanitarian law? The answer, darkly, is no. The mechanics of fear, once perfected for the state's convenience in the late Middle Ages, have evolved into institutional memories that resonate disturbingly into our own time. We found that the most durable product of this dark industry was not a specific iron or a unique brand of burn. It was structure. It was the standardized process. From the rigorous documentation detailing how much leverage could be applied with the rack, to the mandated paperwork confirming who had overseen the precise application of pitch, these protocols transcended the bodies that endured them and became integrated into the very architecture of legal thought. The state's primary concern was never just extracting truth. It was generating verifiable process. And a highly functional bureaucratic process can survive centuries, regardless of the moral revolutions attempting to dismantle it. The transition from medieval courtrooms to modern investigative facilities mirrors this unnerving institutional continuity. The principles that legitimized suffering, then the need for an absolutely certain answer, the suspicion inherent in civic life, and the assumption that truth must be painful enough to reveal itself, have simply been reframed with new terminology. Where the Inquisitor once wielded scripture and physical restraints, the modern interrogator often wields behavioral science, psychological profiling, and meticulously crafted deception. But note the functional similarity. Both systems are predicated on a core premise: that resistance is temporary, that discomfort leads to compliance, and that the deepest form of control is not merely physical coercion, but cognitive exhaustion. Consider the modern confession protocol. It bears an intellectual lineage directly from Chapter 7, the moment when state power perfected the art of manufacturing consensus through duress. The goal remained constant: achieving a narratively useful outcome, one that justified the existing order and stabilized the centers of power, whether the pain was derived from a boiling oil bath or from prolonged isolation followed by carefully orchestrated false leads. The mechanism was identical. It was the systematic collapse of self-determination until the individual complied with the script written by those who held authority. The infrastructure necessary to manage this process is equally haunting: the demand for specialized personnel, those who understand how far a human being can be pushed before breaking entirely, did not disappear. Instead, it morphed into fields of expertise: behavioral psychology, interrogation training, and risk assessment modeling. These modern disciplines, while presenting themselves as purely scientific, are often underpinned by a deeply persistent, archaic understanding of compliance derived from centuries of enforced agony. The cage has changed its materials. The iron restraints have been replaced by soundproof rooms designed to limit sensory input. The brand marks on the skin have been supplanted by digital dossiers containing every failure, fear, and alleged weakness an individual possesses. But what is this modern dossier? Fundamentally, if not a highly organized record of vulnerability, it is the contemporary equivalent of the state's ledger book detailing the subject's disposable value. The enduring lesson from the history of torture is therefore deeply unsettling, that institutional brutality is rarely accidental. It is systematic. It requires administrators, clerks, specialized manuals, and a belief in its own necessary utility. When we look at modern legal or national security apparatuses, where protocols govern everything from acceptable questioning times to mandated separation techniques, we are witnessing the echoes of the medieval workshop. The paperwork remains the documentation of process, and this paperwork provides a psychological shield for those who wield it. It allows them to categorize and neutralize suffering as nothing more than an operational requirement or a necessary step in due process, thereby divorcing the act from its moral weight. This detachment is the most terrifying survival mechanism. The state has learned how to make its brutality appear not just inevitable, but scientific asterisk. It has formalized ethical bypasses and bureaucratic safeguards that allow individuals within powerful institutions to participate in controlled suffering without confronting the profound humanity of what they are doing. They operate under the shield of procedure, a profoundly comforting intellectual structure built over primal acts of pain. The final challenge posed by this history is one of vigilance. We must resist the temptation to treat these protocols as mere historical curiosities, as something safely contained within stained parchment and iron devices. Instead, we must see them for what they are: blueprints for control. Understanding how a society once commodified anguish, turning human terror into a quantifiable input for state stability, is not merely an academic exercise. It is a vital intellectual defense against the slow, bureaucratic creep back toward unaccountable power, reminding us that the ability to institutionalize pain remains one of humanity's most pervasive and dangerous enduring technologies. The previous chapters meticulously cataloged the instruments of pain, charting a course from the mechanical horror of the rack to the sophisticated chemistry of boiling pitch. We learned how suffering was not merely endured, but documented, processed, and legally approved. The history we have uncovered is one not of sporadic violence, but of meticulous administration, and this brings us to the institutional bruise, the lasting mark that no amount of soap or rehabilitation can remove. It is not about the bones broken or the skin scarred. It is about the deeply embedded habits of control, the bureaucratic ghost lingering in our legal and psychological frameworks. The true legacy of medieval pain is far more subtle than any branding iron. The systematic approach to suffering we witnessed was a sophisticated exercise in behavioral modification, a pre-modern form of what we might today call statecraft psychology. It taught societies how to manage doubt and how to monetize fear. By demanding visible signs of pain, the scar, the testimony obtained through agony, the meticulously filed report detailing the duration and degree of torment, these systems built an entire architecture of necessary suspicion. The ultimate product was not a confession of truth. It was merely evidence that the asterisk process asterisk had occurred correctly. The system needed to prove its own legitimacy before it could assume its authority. It required witnesses, records, and protocols proving that due process, no matter how barbaric, had been followed. This focus on procedure, this obsession with paperwork, is perhaps the most chilling artifact of all. We must ask ourselves, what aspects of institutional control survived the Renaissance? What echoes of the inquisitorial workshop remain dormant within our supposedly progressive modern institutions? The principles that made suffering a transaction in the medieval setting, where pain bought stability and compliance, are startlingly familiar. Consider the interrogation room today, stripped of its pitch and iron. The devices have been replaced by fluorescent lighting, audio-visual recording equipment, and the cold comfort of psychological detachment. Yet, the underlying bureaucratic logic persists. We still deal in narratives, records, and protocols. The methodology has changed from physical application to systemic management. Instead of stretching joints, we analyze trauma. Instead of branding flesh, we build profiles. The goal remains identical, breaking the subject's will until they cooperate with the established narrative. But now, the control is internalized, disguised not by shackles, but by specialized techniques of questioning and emotional exhaustion. The intellectualization of coercion is the genius and the terror of this history. Medieval torturers needed law books and theological consensus to justify their actions. Modern state mechanisms require only expert jargon, statistical models, and plausible scientific detachment. The due process that protects us often relies on a similar scaffolding of mandatory procedure: the questionnaire completion rate, the structured debriefing interview, the cross-reference verification. These are all protocols born from the ancient requirement to legitimize cruelty through paperwork. The bruises we wear today are not visible slashes, but systemic ones. The exhaustion of endless documentation, the fatigue of complying with unseen informational demands, the pervasive sense that our reality must constantly be justified, explained, and categorized for external approval. We have merely exchanged overt public torture for subtle, mandatory psychological performance. Sleepwalking through history means recognizing this seamless transition. It means understanding that the impulse to institutionalize pain, not just physical pain, but the cognitive pain of uncertainty, is profoundly human and dangerously adaptable. The machinery of control, once powered by divine fear or literal rack tension, has simply repurposed itself, running quietly on fuel we willingly provide. Our willingness to comply with complex bureaucratic expectations. This history compels us toward a sustained vigilance. It demands that we never assume the neutrality of institutional process. We must continually question not just asterisk what asterisk is being asked, but asterisk why asterisk the procedure itself. The adherence to its own rules and forms is presented as inherently beneficial or unassailable. The moment we accept that the protocol, no matter how seemingly benign or scientific, is an end unto itself, that is the moment we begin to wear our own institutional bruises, unknowingly reinforcing a system of control far more pervasive